Turmoil in the house of Saud. Could the killing of Jamal Khashoggi stop the crown prince from becoming king? I'm Imran Gata, and today's newsmaker is Mohammed bin Salman. A bombshell from Reuters. The news agency reports that dozens of princes and cousins within Saudi Arabia's ruling family want a change over who will become the next king. First in line to the throne, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been under increasing criticism for a crackdown against powerful businessmen and members of his own family. Meanwhile, human rights organizations continue to condemn his military bombardment in Yemen. And possibly the most damning development is the alleged assessment by the CIA that he ordered the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate here in Istanbul. So, is it possible that the Crown Prince's attempt to consolidate power and quash criticism could lead to his downfall? That debate in a moment, but first here's Haider Abbasi.
Global condemnation is growing for the Saudi Crown Prince. It's clear that journalist Jamal Khashoggi was killed in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. And Saudi Arabia has arrested and charged 18 suspects. But the question remains, was the Saudi leadership involved? Many fingers are being pointed at this man, the heir to the throne of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. The CIA reportedly says it was the Crown Prince himself who ordered Khashoggi's murder. Members of the US Congress also accuse him of being behind the killing.
15 people, 18, whatever the number was, they don't get on two airplanes, go to Turkey and chop a guy up in the consulate who's a critic of the Crown Prince without the Crown Prince having known about it and sanctioned it.
Senators are now demanding the CIA report be made public. Trump's initial response was to criticize the CIA's findings.
That was a very premature report, but that's possible. We're going to see, but we're going to have a report on Tuesday, and it'll be very complete.
Saudi Arabia rejects any allegations that Crown Prince Mohammed was involved.
His Royal Highness the Crown Prince has nothing to do with this issue. In fact, the National Security Advisor in the US said this. This was a rogue operation.
On Friday, funeral prayers were held for Jamal Khashoggi in mosques around the world. But the Saudi critic's body still hasn't been found. Khashoggi was killed in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul on October the 2nd. His killing might permanently change US-Saudi relations. But from the start, Donald Trump has stressed the importance of his country's ties with the kingdom.
You know, we also have a great ally in Saudi Arabia. They give us a lot of jobs, they give us a lot of business, a lot of economic development. They have been a truly spectacular ally in terms of jobs and economic development.
And it's not just money that attracted Trump to Riyadh. Saudi Arabia and the United States have both been trying to isolate Iran. And the White House is working closely with Saudi Arabia to find a deal to end the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. But repercussions from Khashoggi's death are not just being felt in the United States. A Reuters report says that Saudi princes are pushing to have Mohammed bin Salman removed as heir to the throne, but they won't act while the King of Saudi Arabia is still alive. So can the Crown Prince recover from this affair? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now on set here is Fatih Erkay. He's the Executive Director of the Turkish Arab Media Association, an NGO that Jamal Khashoggi advised. From Washington, D.C., we have Matthew Brodsky. He's a senior fellow at the Security Studies Group. Also in Washington, we have Saudi affairs expert Ali Al-Ahmed. Gentlemen, welcome to the Newsmakers. Ali Al-Ahmed, let me begin with you. So far, it's clear the king has backed his son. The next in line, he has praised the judicial system for the actions that they are taking in Saudi Arabia for those allegedly involved. However, Reuters reporting that several high-profile princes and others within the ruling family want MBS out. They want Mohammed bin Salman out, and there's a restlessness within the royal family. What do you make of that?
It's not a secret that the other members of the ruling family have been trying and vowing for power in the kingdom, And did not start after Jamal Khashoggi's murder. It started early, and it has been always ongoing. Let us remember, in Saudi history, the first crown prince was killed by his brother. Then the second king was overthrown by his brother Faisal, and Faisal was assassinated. So, and there has been always competition and a struggle for power. This is nothing new. However, I think now there is a greater opportunity for international support, because MBS is being seen as unfit to rule the country. And I think they're just taking credit, and they are planting these stories in the media that, oh, there is something happening. I do not see it, because they don't need it to put it out there. If they are going to do it, they would have already done it. And the reality is, members of the ruling family, no matter how senior they are, cannot do anything to MBS. He has all the power. They have no army, no military or security forces to back them. If the U.S. decides to back them, I think there is somebody in the U.S. who wants to have a different prince ruling the country, but it has not really come to an actionable plan yet.
Matthew Brodsky, is President Trump protecting Mohammed bin Salman in order to preserve the relationship with the Saudis, no matter what?
Well, I think President Trump, as opposed to much of the American media, is approaching this entire problem from a position of looking at what America's interests and values are and trying to bring them into balance. And what that means in this situation is that, as bad of a crime as this is, the United States still needs a working relationship with Saudi Arabia, given what it contributes to the United States in the Middle East, what it's doing on behalf of keeping the oil markets stable as the U.S. has reimposed sanctions on Iran. So there are many things that that Saudi Arabia and the United States have been working on together. So, but again, this relationship is not based on humanitarian issues. It's based on American interests, and specifically in the Middle East.
Certainly, and that's realpolitik. Let me come in here.
That have different.
Let me ask an addition to that question, just to sort of drill down and get some clarity here. So that's the realpolitik, right? But America has these stated objectives and these stated values, and, if you're going to be doing terrible things, we're not going to do business with you. Is there any amount of evidence that can be presented to President Trump that would make him have to end the relationship, or maybe even severely restrict the relationship? So we see the CIA assessment, and what we're hearing is the CIA feels Mohammed bin Salman ordered this. We're hearing from members of the State Department that Mohammed bin Salman ordered this. Is there any amount of evidence presented to President Trump where he has to do something, or will he protect at all costs?
I don't think any of this, the new details aren't really changing the fundamental way in which the United States views its relationships and its system of allies and adversaries. So I understand why it's in Turkey's interest and Qatar's interest and in the interest of many from the previous administration who want to see us back in a partnership with Iran and downgrading our relations with Saudi Arabia. I can see why it's in their interest to keep continuing the focus on a drip, drip, drip of information coming out each day. But in the end, it doesn't really change the fundamental facts, which is the U.S. has a partnership with Saudi Arabia, and the countries that are currently getting out this information have very different priorities on a host of issues from the United States.
Certainly, isn't it in the interest of the United States, the taxpayers and others, that what if it has nothing to do with Iran? What if it has nothing to do with Barack Obama supporters or Turkish interests or Qatari interests? What if it merely has to do with the fact that people don't want the United States to do business with a guy who calls a citizen to a consulate and has him chopped up?
Right. So the question that then you're asking is, should the U.S. just simply react out of the horror from this? I mean, this goes both ways. Of course, the United States is going to keep working with allies who are doing things with the country. I mean, if Americans were to start asking the exact same questions, should we be doing business with countries that are been helping Iran escape sanctions, with countries that have been helping promote ISIS over the past few years, with countries who are attacking U.S. allies throughout the region, then we'd be talking about Turkey. And of course, that's not the way the United States deals with that relationship either. It looks at relations, and it looks at who our allies are and who are acting within our interest. And that's the important metric that the United States is using to measure. It's not about Turkey and Qatar keeping enough information leaking out day by day about how horrible this event was. It was bad.
I appreciate your candor, and the dig was recognized. So I just want to ask you, just for clarity, before I bring Fatih in, just in case, Fatih, you think that we invited you and we're not letting you speak. Matthew, any evidence that Turkey is helping ISIS? Because you threw that in there.
We know how many people have come through the territory to join ISIS to begin with. We know that they've been chomping up bits of Syria and trying to expand its neo-Ottoman empire.
I've asked you if there's any evidence that Turkey is helping ISIS.
We know that it's been threatening to destroy our allies.
You've said people have moved through Turkey. Is that evidence that they've helped ISIS?
The evidence that we have about skirting sanctions with Iran is, of course, quite clear. And essentially, with selling and trading oil with ISIS while it held on to the northeast.
Iran is an avowed enemy of ISIS.
This is something that's been well documented.
Matthew,
we know
Iran's an avowed enemy of ISIS. ISIS is an avowed enemy of Iran. I don't understand. Again, and I don't want this to become
But Turkey's been playing both sides. We understand this.
Do you have any evidence of this? This is what I'm asking you.
This is what I'm saying, though. If we are going to have an actual policy that's based on what our interests are, then we need to look at that, not just look at what the latest horror
Hold on, Matthew. So I asked you, if they chopped up a guy in a consulate, is it worth breaking ties over? You said no. And you said that we still keep a relationship with Turkey and Turkey helps ISIS. I've asked you for evidence that Turkey helps ISIS and you haven't provided any.
Okay, why are you guys then attacking our allies, the Kurds?
Hold on.
If you're doing that, then we can't help fight ISIS, and that's just what we're talking in the past
different story altogether.
When you have your own foreign minister
I've asked you a very simple
question.
question.
Keep attacking.
Do you have any evidence that Turkey supports ISIS? Yes or no? Any evidence that Turkey supports ISIS?
Yes, you watched them come from Europe. You've watched refugees come from Europe and then sent them on through into Syria to join ISIS. Because the thinking then from Turkey was that this would be the force that would overthrow Assad.
Fair enough. I'm going to leave it at that.
And this has been in the news before everyone got amnesia.
Matthew, I don't think it's very good for your argument because I've asked you about a very specific case with Jamal Khashoggi.
I didn't walk around with a page of links for you.
Okay. Let me bring in Fatih. Fatih, I appreciate Matthew's candor and his openness here when he talks about the fact that, listen, no matter what happens, or what happened in the consulate, ultimately, this is about more than just the horror of the human rights of Jamal Khashoggi, right? You were his friend, you worked with him, and so on. How do you feel about that, that ultimately, in the bigger picture of realpolitik, you're going to have people like Matthew saying, come on, this is a massive relationship with the United States. The US is never going to end this relationship, no matter how much evidence there is that this was ordered from the very top in the most grotesque way.
This is very simple, actually. People killed in the most horrific way in the world history, in an embassy, in a diplomatic premise. It's a crime. I don't want to read this issue with macro measurements and real politics. Just basically, they killed him. They tried to mute a voice, which is very strong voice from United States, from Washington Post. They tried to mute him, and they mute. And now the things are going in a different way, and they didn't delete some proofs, some realities, and the things is coming to that way. And ISIS and Turkey said, come on, this is not the issue. The reality is they killed a man in an embassy, in a consulate. This is important. It is very important for Islamic republics, Islamic democracies, because they should accept it. Saudi should accept this crime.
But they're saying they're putting the people who did it, they want the death penalty for 5, and the others are also being prosecuted. They're finding the people who did this.
Good.
Why don't you trust them?
It's very good. They find 18 men. But we are still waiting the 19 men. Who gave the order? They didn't put any proof on that. And now we are seeing the CIA reports and probably they will release it. And now just someone from the Foreign Department in America told that, yes, it's from MBS.
But isn't it also convenient that the entire Muslim Ummah suddenly now trusts the CIA's reports, right? Suddenly, okay, the CIA
No, actually, they are trusting the Turkish reports,
okay,
which not released yet,
right,
but Turkish reports affected CIA reports. It's very obvious, everybody knows it.
Are you convinced that this came from the very top in Saudi Arabia?
Of course, it's very obvious. It is very obvious. And we in Turkish Arab Media Association, we called the old Ali Saud, the Saud family, and the elders of Saudi Arabia, big tribes, we call them to give us a real justice,
right,
and give us the real name to protect the Saudi honor,
right?
Because there's no tradition in Saudi to chop a man, to dismember a man in the embassy. No, we didn't heard. Yes, they have a death penalty with sword,
right?
And they are the only country who carries two swords in their flag, of course. Right. But come on, it's
okay. Let me bring in Ali Al Ahmed. I want to ask Ali Al Ahmed. Ali, for years you have spoken out against the Saudi government. That's one of the reasons why you're in the United States. And I've spoken to you quite often on this show and other shows, right? You've complained about Saudi actions elsewhere in Yemen and in terms of human rights repression and so on. It took for this incident, for a country like Germany, for example, to cut arms trade with the Saudis, at least for now. It took for this incident to bring someone like Lindsey Graham out to say this is wrong and we need to relook at Yemen. How do you feel about that? Does it seem genuine or disingenuous?
It's very hard for me to believe this is genuine. I want to just address what Matt said about values. This is absurd because the United States was allied with Stalin. And I'm quoting Mr. Trump, who said that Obama created ISIS. True, the United States, through a security apparatus, maybe we're using other countries in the region, supported ISIS to achieve certain goals. So let's not pretend that the United States here is an angel.
Yeah, but
governments.
Ali, the United States says they had to support Stalin to defeat Hitler, and at the moment they're saying we have to support Saudi to defeat Iran.
This is of course this is not value. So I don't want to hear this value stuff again because if you have aligned with Stalin. If you are also, the U.S. is implicated in creating Al Qaeda and creating ISIS and supporting these. And this has been my work for a long time. I've written reports about it in details. The issue here is we have the Saudi. I mean, just for the fact that the U.S. has been providing security for the Saudi monarchy, this in itself tells us there's no value used in this relationship. So. A monarchy that does not allow women to drive or treats women like slaves, this is not based on values. So I don't want to hear this thing about values again, please. It is very...
Is he done? This is 10 minutes of garbage that I didn't even say.
Serious stuff. This is not, it's about the people. Our people are not slaves that should be support a monarchy who takes their humanity away. So America takes part of the blame for supporting this monarchy and other monarchies and other dictators. Just like Jean Kirkpatrick said, international dictators are bastards, but they are our bastards.
Matthew, why do you think this is garbage?
American policy.
What I said is that we do this based on the intersection of our interests, which is the most important part, and where that intersects with our values, and we try to bring them into balance. It's about interest. This was the point that I stressed, and this is the point that I made. So it's fine that he wants to address something that I didn't say. That's fine. Clearly, our foreign policy is not based on sharing the values that we have with Saudi Arabia, the Western values that we bring, the Judeo-Christian values. No, that's not the basis of our relationship, obviously. And of course we were allies with Stalin when we were against an enemy such as the Nazis. But this is neither here nor there. This is ridiculous. The guy just spoke for 5 minutes addressing something that I never said. It wasn't even the point. It's about interests,
I spoke less than you.
Okay. Ali Al Ahmed,
you said values. I didn't say
values. Is Mohammed bin Salman, Ali, going to survive this?
Yes, absolutely. I think so. Look, Mr. Khashoggi's murder is awful. It's condemned, but there are greater crimes that the U.S. continues to help the Saudi monarchy. The funny thing is that the United States was founded on removing an absolute monarchy from this land. yet now it continues to support the largest absolute monarchy and the most backward monarchy in the world. So yeah, Yemen crimes, killing children is worse than killing Mr. Khashoggi. It is a murder, it's a horrendous murder, but killing 100,000 children in Yemen, that's much worse. Yet the United States keeps doing it, continues to do it because of these so-called values.
Okay, I appreciate all your honesty and your candor. Fatih Erkay, Ali Al-Ahmed and Matthew Brodsky, thanks for joining us. Still to come on the program, Colombo in crisis. A power struggle in Sri Lanka leads to violence in parliament. How can the deadlock be solved? And the UN's top investigator on poverty lambasts the UK government. Philip Olsen joins me in just a few moments. Sri Lanka's president, Maithripala Sirisena, came to power with promises of economic security, an end to corruption, and a return to the rule of law. But the country's hopes for stability have been thrown into uncertainty. It all started when Sirisena appointed former leader Mahinda Rajapaksa to replace the prime minister. Rajapaksa has been accused of widespread nepotism, along with brutally ending a war with the North's Tamil Tigers by also killing thousands of civilians. The threat of a renewed authoritarianism was enough for Rajapaksa to lose a no-confidence vote, one that was marred by scuffles within parliament. With more on this, here's Shoaib Hassan.
It's been compared to a political coup, and it's left Sri Lanka in crisis. President Maithripala Sirisena's shock move to dissolve parliament and call elections has enraged politicians. He did it after removing coalition partner and now former Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe, and in his place installing former President and rival Mahinda Rajapaksa. The Supreme Court ruled against the dismissal of Parliament and suspended the call for snap elections. That allowed Parliament to reconvene and hold a vote of confidence on Rajapaksa on Wednesday, which he lost. The crisis has led to protests on the streets and brawls inside Parliament.
It's the damage done to the system. 85 years history, we have to be ashamed of this. Never has this happened before. I mean, as an incident, we have seen incidents in Parliament, but not like this.
The President's reasons for dismissing Wickremesinghe were growing foreign debt and failure to implement government reforms. But political analysts say both the Prime Minister and the President are responsible for the political infighting that has crippled the economy and led to riots against minorities, particularly Muslims. They say the turmoil has strengthened Rajapaksa's position. Most Sri Lankans are supporting the former president because he's seen as a strong leader who ended the long-running Tamil insurgency in 2009 and restored order in Sri Lanka. But he's also been accused of widespread human rights abuses and siphoning off funds from huge infrastructure projects, mainly financed by China. That's left Sri Lanka in debt to Beijing, and it may also be why China is the only country that's welcomed his reappointment. The US, EU, and neighboring India have all expressed concern over the president's actions and called for the restoration of parliament. Sri Lanka is now in limbo, and neither side appears willing to back down as parliament prepares to hold another session on 26 November. Will the two sides be able to negotiate a way out, or will Sri Lanka sink deeper into political uncertainty? Shoaib Hassan, The Newsmakers.
Well, to help understand what's happening in Sri Lanka, we're joined from the capital, Colombo, by former government advisor Rajiva Vujasena. And in Oxford, England, we have Shamara Wettimuni, an associate at Verite Research. I thank you both for joining us on The Newsmakers. Shamara, let me begin with you. With everything that's happened over the past few weeks in Sri Lanka, is Sri Lankan democracy under threat?
That's a good question. Thank you. I think the manner in which former President Mahinda Rajapaksa came into power with the SLPP on the 26th of October was deeply problematic. And his refusal to accept the verdict of not one but two no-confidence motions passed against him suggests that democratic norms aren't being adhered to at the moment. So yes, at this moment, it does appear that democracy is under threat.
So we're hearing, Rajiva, from Shamara, that democratic norms are under threat in Sri Lanka. Do you agree with that?
Well, I think the whole polity is certainly under threat, but it depends on how you define democracy. There is a school of thought that says that the Mahinda Rajapaksa has had a vote of no confidence passed against him. That's not quite correct, because there are procedures for votes of no confidence and they were not followed. And what was termed the standing orders were suspended, which is really quite improper. But I do believe very strongly that, obviously, when the president appoints the prime minister, there should be a check on the parliamentary vote. And it really is a pity that when Parliament reconvened on the 14th, the motion was not tabled so that it could have been taken up 5 days later, as is specified. Instead, there was all this talk of having things like voice votes. And you can't really have a voice vote on a matter of no confidence. The larger question really is, how do we resolve the ambiguities in our constitution? Sri Lanka is an elected presidential system, which I believe have in Turkey as well. And there are certain powers to the president, which of course can be exercised only in the context of the checks and balances of the legislature. But the president is the executive head. And unfortunately, when this president was elected, while we all agreed that the president's powers should be modified and reduced, there was an effort by the former Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe and his advisors to smuggle in that the president should only act on the advice of the Prime Minister, and that was not acceptable. So there are certain ambiguities, and the best way of resolving them is through appealing to the Supreme Court. And I was rather sad that the former Prime Minister and his advisors did not go to the Supreme Court to check on the constitutionality or otherwise of his dismissal and his replacement by somebody in whom the president thinks.
Okay, so let me ask Shamara. Shamara, should they have gone to the Supreme Court? Was that the next logical step?
It appears that the UNF or the UNP did decide to do this through a vote in Parliament. Now, I would defer to what Professor Vijay Singha has said about, procedures and standing orders, as I'm sure he knows far more about it than I do. But I wonder whether we could maybe look at the context, the political context in which they decided to take this vote by voice, and also to do this through Parliament. So I wonder if you have seen the footage in which they tried. So first of all, on the issue of suspending standing orders, it comes in the context where Parliament had initially been prorogued and then dissolved in order to prevent a vote of no confidence from taking place. And that is why, that to me is an assault on Parliament. And so in that sense, the suspending standing orders and then going in for a vote of no confidence is understandable. And on the issue of the vote by voice, again, I believe, yes, maybe they should have done it through electronic vote or vote by, a proper vote. However, if you have seen the footage from Parliament last week, it was absolute thuggery on display. Right. It was honestly very, very shameful. There was chili powder being thrown. There was someone occupying the speaker's seat. There were attempts to prevent the speaker from entering. Yeah. And when he enters Parliament with the protection of policemen, there was chili powder, books being thrown at him, pieces of his chair being torn apart and thrown at him. So it was in that context that he had to resort to taking a vote by voice. Right. And I'm afraid it was to do with the context at the time.
Yeah, and we're looking at those pictures, people throwing punches, not just chili powder. It was a big chaotic mess, right?
It's most disgraceful.
Right. So, Rajiva, let me ask you, as we go back to the fundamentals at the very beginning of this crisis, was President Sirisena wrong to sack Mr. Wickremesinghe, the Prime Minister? Or was he right to sack the Prime Minister, but was he maybe wrong to appoint the former leader, Mr. Rajapaksa, in his position as Prime Minister? Or was he right for both actions, or what do you think?
Well, the first question is it constitutional to dismiss a prime minister? I believe it is, but there is ambiguity in the constitution. I was actually looking through my notes, and way back in 2015, I actually proposed several amendments, and I kept saying, why don't we have consistency? But that was ignored. There was a great rush and lots of ambiguity. But I think there is ambiguity. I think the president was right to take a decision in what he thought was the interests of the country. And I think he believed that Mahinda Rajapaksa was the best prime minister under the circumstances. I personally think that whether Mahinda Rajapaksa is going to be a good prime minister or not remains to be seen. But I certainly believe he'll be a better prime minister than Ranil Wickremesinghe. And I suspect this was the president's thinking. And perhaps the president should have acted earlier when in February earlier this year, the prime minister's party, and indeed his own, got a really pitiful amount of votes compared to Mahinda Rajapaksa. So I think it's fairly clear where the confidence of the country lies. But there is the constitutional provision that once the prime minister is appointed, he should be able to show that he has the confidence of the House. And as I said, it's been a farrago of really horrible behavior by both sides. There was the chili powder being thrown, but the day before that, the opposition members had brought in knives into Parliament. And, it was only two of them. Yesterday, I was telling some of the very decent people in the opposition, how could they countenance this? And of course, both sides will claim that the other is worse than they are. But the simple fact is both sets of parliamentarians, a few on either side, I should say, have behaved appallingly. That is why I think the best thing is to have recourse to the courts. The UNP has gone to the courts with regard to the resolution of Parliament. And I think we should actually await a legal approach to the clear ambiguities in the Constitution.
Shamara, Mr. Rajapaksa is hardly the most unifying figure in the country. Tell me what his appointment has meant for all issues, whether it's reconciliation, especially in parts affected by the civil war with the Tamil Tigers, whether it's issues of Sri Lankan identity. Is he going to be a divisive figure?
Thank you. As Professor Wijesinghe said, in February 2018, his party did comparatively much better than the other two parties. He won something like 40% of the vote at the local government elections in February, suggesting that he does have a significant amount of support behind him. But on issues of reconciliation, minority rights, there is a huge, huge question mark. And unfortunately, what we saw, I think it was yesterday, a protest and then a meeting granted to representatives of the Bodubala Sena by President Maithripala Sirisena, possibly to discuss the release of Nyanasara Thera, someone who was imprisoned on the charge of contempt of court. However, he is someone who has been closely associated with incitement to violence against Muslims and other minorities. Now, this itself is indicative that any progress, which admittedly was very incremental under this Yahapalaniya government, may actually be reversed under a Mahinda Rajapaksa government once again.
So, Rajiva, those who see this as a sign of a more sort of aggressive, non-inclusive Sinhala nationalism that comes with all sorts of things that might make life more difficult for minorities in Sri Lanka, is that a warranted fear?
Well, I think certainly given the way the Mahinda Rajapaksa government behaved in its last couple of years, there are reasons for worry. As you probably know, well, you may not know this, but I was in a few parliamentarians on Mahinda Rajapaksa's side who supported Sirisena on the grounds that Rajapaksa was not being inclusive enough, was not moving on the reforms he promised. But I have to say that there was great disappointment with the way the Sirisena-Wickremesinghe government behaved. But one of my last conversations with Mahinda Rajapaksa before I left was I told him how appallingly Reverend Nyanasara had behaved. And I asked him why he wasn't tougher about that. And of course, he had two answers, one of which I have to grant was not entirely accurate, was not entirely wrong. He said, the Americans are paying this man to make me unpopular. And of course, I knew that the Norwegians had in fact given Nyanasara a lot of money. I don't think they intended him to behave as badly he did with the money, but they never checked as to what he was doing with it. And of course, Mahinda Rajapaksa has a sharp tongue. When I told him you really should be much tougher with him, his answer, well, people like you will claim that I'm violating their human rights. But I fully agree with Shamara that people like Nyanasara need to be tightly controlled and not allowed to do this type of thing. I would like to hope that Mahinda Rajapaksa has, learned his lesson. And of course, the fact is that Sirisena himself does have a reputation for pluralism. The failure to move on reconciliation, of course, by this government, which had no reason not to, has been, to my mind, shocking. And I think the lack of attention to the development of the areas in which the minorities stay is very disappointing. And, one thing that has to be remembered is that one of the reasons for the February result was, as Bill Clinton said, it's the economy stupid and people getting poorer and poorer. Before the change happened, the rupee plummeted from 150 to 175. And of course, that's partly due to the strengthening dollar. But we did nothing to correct that. And, the government was, talking in mixed tones. Some people said, no, it's very good for exports. And others said, no, we've got to stop it. And I think we have to understand that while the issues of, pluralism are very important, I think it's also important to make sure that the country continues with the development and the growth rates that we saw in Rajapaksa's last 2 years.
Right. And at the heart of all of that is a disagreement about how to actually do that. So, Shamara, there's an idea that the one camp is looking east and west, or north, east and west, and the other camp, the camp that's in power right now, only wants to look east and only wants to do business with the Chinese. Is that the way it's playing out?
Former Mahinda Rajapaksa government certainly did do a lot of business with the East, but we actually have seen the Ranil Wickremesinghe government as well enter, into agreements with China as well as other parts of the world. I think the issue at stake at the moment is that prolonging this particular crisis is only going to lead to further financial instability. Now, the rupee has been doing pretty badly over the year, but actually I had a look at the trajectory of the rupee in the last couple of weeks, and it depreciated significantly again. There was a drop on November 10th, the day after the president announced his decision to dissolve parliament. And just today, actually, we've received news that Moody's has downgraded Sri Lanka's financial status to B2. Now, this means higher interest rates for our debt repayments. We have one big repayment coming up in January. And so, this crisis is actually going to cause us a lot more financial problems than previously envisaged. And that is the premise on which Mahinda Rajapaksa came in on, claiming that he could solve this financial crisis or instability that we have been seeing under the previous government. But that does not appear to be panning out at the moment.
Right. So, Rajiva, why should Sri Lankans trust the man who signed a deal with the Chinese over a port that left Sri Lanka billions of dollars in debt?
I think you've got it all wrong. The Mahinda Rajapaksa government wanted to develop the Hambantota port and offered it to India first. And India was not able to take it up. I discussed this later with the Indian High Commissioner. He said, perhaps we made a mistake about that. And then he approached China and got a loan on reasonably good terms. And the sovereignty remained with us. But, I think the Americans and also the Indians got a bit worried because the Chinese sent in submarines. The Americans think that only they can send submarines in anywhere and no one else should. Sri Lanka didn't say only the Chinese can send in submarines. They actually have allowed all these guys to do that. But the real problem came in that after the last election, this particular government, in particular Wickremesinghe and his then foreign minister, insulted the Chinese. I suppose they thought the West would come and bail them out. They thought they could behave like Israel and do anything they liked and the West would love them. But as you know, the West had little money, so they had to turn to the Chinese. And it was then that the Chinese, I think, basically screwed them. Well, the Chinese had dealt reasonably well with Rajapaksa in terms of interest rate. The Chinese got a 99-year lease on the Hambantota port, which is outrageous. And Rajapaksa was the first to protest about this. And the Indians were very upset, but their solution was to ask Wickremesinghe to give them a part of the Colombo port. And when I spoke on Indian television last week, they said, well, isn't it very unfair that China should have one port and we shouldn't have another? I mean, that is nonsense. The Wickremesinghe government was, I think, wrong to give a 99-year lease to China. But of course, they plunged the country into massive economic crisis because there was a bond scam where, interest rates were 10%. And Ranil Wickremesinghe, central bank governor, gave bonds worth 10 billion to the only bidder, who happened to be his son-in-law. And a great deal of money was then given to the United National Party members. So I think with that, we had a very, very serious crisis of confidence in our central bank. And that meant that, they turned to China and gave in to demands that they shouldn't have given in to.
Right. And I appreciate you giving us the timeline as it evolved over the years. Let's talk politics again as we wrap up, Shamara. There's a way of looking at this to think that, well, if they can't hold things together in Parliament and they're scuffling in Parliament, how are they going to instill and inspire confidence for Sri Lankans to hold it together on the streets, right? So there's a constitutional crisis, there's political instability. Can they keep things together until elections in 2020, or does something drastic need to happen in the next year and a half so that things don't spiral out of control?
I imagine what you're also asking me about is the possibility of early elections. Now, on that issue, I think if we want to talk about elections, you need to think about it in terms of incentives for the three main blocks or players in this scenario. So the president, I mean, does he have incentive to call early elections? I think it's less about that, but more in terms of what political space or what the situation will be for him in a post-election context. For Mahinda Rajapaksa and the SLPP, early elections is certainly something that they want and they are calling for at the moment. And this would be to capitalize on their electoral success or gains in the February election. But I would say that, and then lastly, the UNP, I don't know whether they would have wanted elections a few months ago. However, given the events of the last couple of weeks, we've actually seen a surge in support for the UNF, the UNP, and so they may actually be incentivized to go for elections now, which I don't think they would have been a couple of months ago, more than a month ago. But I think the other question on the issue of elections is who would control state resources at the time of an election, and that is more likely to determine the timing of elections.
Yeah, fluid time, uncertain time politically in the country. Rajiva Wijasena and Shamara Wetimuni, looking forward to having you back on the Newsmakers soon. Thanks so much for joining us.
Poverty is really a major challenge in the United Kingdom, and that not nearly enough is currently being done to address the challenges. On the other side, what I found in my discussions with ministers is basically a state of denial.
The UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty says austerity measures in the UK have inflicted misery on the poor. Philip Olsen crisscrossed Britain during a 2-week fact-finding mission. His report says levels of child poverty are a disgrace, and that cuts to social welfare benefits are why 14 million people remain poor in one of the world's richest countries. Olsen went on to condemn the government, saying poverty in the UK is a political choice. Well, British Conservatives have rebuked the report, calling Olsen's findings political. So let's ask him about it. UN Special Rapporteur Philip Olsen joins me from New York. Great pleasure having you on the program. Sir, I'm going to ask you about the accusations and what Amber Rudd had to say in a moment. But let me first ask you to qualify what you said in the report in a nutshell. You've said this is imposed misery, and you've also used the phrase social re-engineering. Tell me what you mean by that and how you qualify it.
The report makes the point that normally when we talk about the really dramatic cuts in welfare and other services in the United Kingdom, it's done under the heading of austerity. Austerity suggests that there's no choice, that it's in order just to bring about fiscal consolidation. My argument is that, in fact, these cuts had very little to do with the need for fiscal consolidation, but rather were a program to to radically change the nature of the welfare state in the United Kingdom. I think if the government set out to do that, it should be proud of itself, because it has really transformed it into a system that is very different from the one that existed before.
Is this a deliberate attempt by the government to impoverish their own society?
I think the philosophy of the government is that the only thing that really matters is employment. Anyone who's poor should get out and work, and anyone who still needs to rely on government assistance is going to be given as hard a time as possible. life is not going to be at all pleasant for them. And that will encourage them to get out and work and reduce their reliance on government. So rather than saying that in any society there's always a small number of people who need some sort of assistance from government, that essentially is not being provided at levels that make it possible for people to survive in dignity.
So the Work and Pensions Secretary, Amber Rudd, says your report is political. First, help me understand what you think she means by that.
Well, I'm sure that she and I would agree. I think that these are questions of politics. I've said that the approach being adopted by the UK government is a political choice. The problem is that I'm coming at it from a human rights perspective, and once you get below a certain level where the right to dignity, right to live in, right to an adequate standard of living and so on are jeopardized, it moves from the political to a point where the obligations that the country has taken on and the values that the government stands for are not being supported.
So as we watch her say that, perhaps I can sort of impose what some of us would be thinking. She's not happy. She says, yes, you make some good points about universal credit and so on, but your language was political, with the inference being that perhaps this guy doesn't like the Tories, perhaps he's a lefty, maybe he's a Labour supporter, maybe he wants Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister. Is that what it is?
I think that would be nonsensical. I didn't meet with Jeremy Corbyn. I have had nothing to do with him. I'm not supporting one party or the other. I've said very clearly that I think if the Conservatives wanted to improve the system on their own terms, they could do it very easily. And I think Amber Rudd is potentially a very good new minister. She's got a strong track record of standing up for women. That's one of the things that really needs to be done in the Work and Pensions Ministry. Mm-hmm. And I think she could change the system without changing the ideology and make really major improvements.
Yeah, so as your report stated, and it's quite shocking, 14 million people living in poverty in the fifth largest economy in the world. Brexit is happening, and there's a lot of uncertainty with regards to Brexit. Is this going to make it worse? Is that the trajectory?
Everyone that I've spoken to and all the studies that I've read indicate that Brexit is going to cost a reasonable amount, or maybe even a lot, in terms of GDP. That's not contested. I think basically the British people have made that choice. They're prepared to trade off some degree of economic well-being for greater sovereignty as they see it. But there is no question that government revenues will fall, that there will be less money available in the public purse. And on present trajectories, it's likely that those who are at the lower end in society are the ones who are really going to suffer the most. Mm-hmm. And unless there's a program in place to cushion that, I think they will be the big losers from Brexit. And of course, the irony is that many observers think that it was precisely because of economic insecurity, because of discontent with globalization, which was blamed on the European Union. That's why a lot of low-income people voted for Brexit. But they will get the double whammy. They're the ones who are really going to suffer the most from Brexit.
And a lot of them were convinced to blame foreigners for their economic woes. There's a bit of buyer's remorse at the moment. Some people are saying that that might not exactly be true. Now, I know that the UK wasn't the first place that you visited and assessed in your capacity as the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. How did the UK compare to other countries that you visited?
Well, it's very hard to do a comparison. I've visited China, Saudi Arabia, Mauritania, Ghana. I think maybe the most relevant comparison is the United States. Mm-hmm. In some ways, the United Kingdom is in a much better position than the US because it still has a national health service. That makes a huge difference. It also still has the outlines of a welfare state. But on the other hand, the UK has introduced punitive measures against those who infringe the system in even very minor ways. that American conservatives could barely even dream of. You can be sanctioned for years in the United Kingdom for things like not turning up for meetings, for providing wrong information on a form and so on. And that's really quite shocking.
Right. And I know that you made the comparison with the US, and you said that the UK government is in denial of the problem. I wonder if the reactions were similar, where with both countries, you come out with your report, you say there's poverty and there's a problem here. Did you get the same thing? Did you get this idea that, listen, we're not Mauritania, we're not a third world country, we're the United States, we're the United Kingdom. You don't get to say this to us.
Yes, I think that's a fairly consistent response. It's not one that troubles me unduly. Certainly, Ambassador Nikki Haley said that I should be looking at Burundi and the Democratic Republic of the Congo because that's where she felt real poverty existed. And as I said, she obviously thinks that 40 million Americans living in poverty by the standards of the US Census Bureau is not a problem. So it's true that many people in developed countries have this sort of smug assumption that, well, we don't have poverty. That is in developing countries, not here. But of course, it's not, governments are expected to respond in this way to the sort of reports that I do. They're going to dismiss them, but that's not the end of the story. In the United States, there's been a huge amount of ongoing discussion about the report that I wrote. And I think in the United Kingdom, this will continue to be an issue in Parliament and elsewhere. It won't be something that the government can just wipe away with a few comments saying it's political.
Right. Yeah, this is fascinating. As far as I understand, this will go to the UN Human Rights Council next year in Geneva. Looking forward to hearing and seeing how that unfolds. Philip Olsen, it's been a pleasure having you on the Newsmakers. Please come back to the show anytime. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, we look at why thousands of Iraq's displaced Yazidis still can't go home to Sinjar 3 years after Daesh was forced out. Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.